Recorded at the Kitchen Studios. This is the Pencil Pushers Podcast.
Welcome, ladies and gents, to the Pencil Pushers Podcast. I'm your humble host, Mike Rosado, and I am super stoked to bring you our chat with editorial cartoonist extraordinaire, V. Cullum Rogers. Rogers is a career cartoonist just recently retired after decades of work with the Durham Herald and the Independent Weekly. We talk about his illustrative career in the field, what it takes to make it in the industry, how he crafts his ideas, and what this challenging but vital medium looks like today and in the future. He was thoughtful, hilarious, and as good a storyteller as you'd expect for someone of his ilk. This one's a classic, folks, so do yourself a favor. Pull up his sites at magazineparody.com and vcrogers.com while you sit back, relax, and listen in on our chat with Cullum. All right, awesome. We are here with V.C. Rogers, also known as Cullum Rogers. Now, should I call you? Is it okay to call you Cullum?
Call me Cullum. V.C. is the name I sign cartoons with.
Great.
And Cullum is what we call my check name.
Awesome. Well, it's really great to have you here. I have been following you for many years, largely through the Indie Weekly's publications, and it's actually been a lot of fun to dig into a little bit more of your history, which has been eye-opening. I had no idea you had done so much more stuff than I had originally thought, which is fantastic. So we're going to dive into that a little bit.
Great.
What we do is at the top of the hour, we pretty much start to talk a little bit more of where you came from in the beginning, like where you were born and how you got into comics, and we can kind of roll in from there.
Well, I was born in Bennettsville, South Carolina, 70 years ago. Back in 1949, and I grew up on a cotton farm just outside of town, and spent a lot of time entertaining myself, the way you do when you grow up on a farm out of town, and was always just picked up pens and started drawing. I mean, I think every kid has these interests. I would like to read magazines and newspapers, and I like to read the funnies, and I started picking up pencils and drawing, and didn't put them down, which is there was a cartoonist once who, every time he was asked, why did you start cartooning, said, why did you quit? And I just didn't quit.
Yeah. And was that something that your family was interested in at all? Did they try to get you influenced by that? Or
not particularly. I mean, I'm descended from a long line of farmers. Yeah. But I had an uncle who married into the family, who was a cartoonist, a man named Chuck Saxon, who drew for the New Yorker for many years. And he did his World War II pilot flight training in Bennettsville, South Carolina, and met a girl named Nancy Rogers, and ended up marrying her. And after that, went to work for Dell Publications and wanted to be a cartoonist and made himself one.
Wow. That's interesting, because when I was reading up about your uncle, I was curious. I was like, well, he was born in New York, and here Cullum's born in South Carolina on a small farm. I thought that was kind of an interesting connection.
How do people, uncles and nephews, get that far apart? Well, the answer is one of them has to marry in the family.
That's right.
Into the family.
That's right. So were you at all aware of his existence as a cartoonist at that time, early on, or
I knew he was a cartoonist. I first actually became aware of him because he worked for Dell Publications for years, and he would bring us comic books before they were published.
Oh wow!
All these Dell comics, hot off the press of the Disney comics.
So he was the cool uncle.
He was the cool uncle from out of town who brought presents down from the big city.
Sure. Yeah. So did he recognize the fact that you had a propensity to getting into drawing at all?
That came later. That actually came. I never really had asked him for advice about cartooning until I started selling them. I was a very slow-witted child, and still am in some ways. But somehow it never occurred to me to ask him about being a cartoonist.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I had asked him, he would have said, well, it's almost impossible to do, and you're not very good. But literally, his first advice to me when I did ask him about becoming a cartoonist, he said, learn to draw.
Wow. Yeah,
And
which is actually quite a. I mean, that's
profound advice.
Yeah, it's great advice. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if it was maybe after he had seen a couple of drawings he wasn't too pleased with.
I think it must have been after he'd seen some drawings he wasn't too pleased with. He'd certainly seen some drawings I wasn't too pleased with, and I was the one drawing them. I mean, that's one of the reasons it took me a while to show him anything, because it took me a while to do anything I thought was worth showing.
Right.
I had no problem selling it and getting it published in a newspaper, but,
Sure.
the idea of showing it to someone and expecting praise for it was a
Yeah.
bit much.
So you wound up going to Davidson, which is, it's not necessarily a college for slow-witted folks. I mean, that's a pretty prestigious college. So you went to school there to get a major in English?
English. I spent my last 2 years of high school at Christ School up near Asheville, college prep school. And then went to Davidson primarily because I had another uncle who had gone there back in the 1930s. And I was just at a stage in my life where I didn't much care where I went to college.
Yeah.
So my mother said, apply to Davidson. My brother went there.
Okay.
And I applied to Davidson and got in and went for 4 years. This was the kind of thought that went into going to college back in the mid-1960s.
Right.
And discovered that, college is 4 years of reading books and taking tests on them, essentially.
Yeah.
A lot of it is. And I said, well, where are the best books? And I discovered that the best books were in the English department, so I majored in that. If I'm going to sit around for 4 years reading, I want to sit around reading good books and not dull books. I discovered at the end of that 4 years that I was not really qualified for any particular kind of employment. And so I did the only thing you can do. I went to graduate school and got a master's degree in English, where I was further disqualified for any particular kind of employment. And after that, I hung around Chapel Hill the way you do.
Right.
Postgraduate school, not wanting to go back to the hometown, but not really having any reason to hang around Chapel Hill, clerked in used bookstores, scribbled, drew the odd picture just for the hell of it. The one picture I did back in those days that is still around is the logo for the Cat's Cradle. Over
Really?
in Chapel Hill. Yeah, that cat rocking the little
Yeah,
cradle,
that was
leaning
you?
on the bar. That was me back in 1975.
Starting an iconic career from the very beginning.
Well, at the time, it was scribbled on the back of a paper towel.
Wow.
And the owner of the cradle at the time, Dave Roberts, said, do that on a better piece of paper, and I'll let you in free. I'll give you, you won't have to pay cover for a couple of years.
Right.
So I said, okay, took real good advantage of not having to pay cover for a couple of years. That may have been one of the more remunerative drawings I ever did, based on the sheer amount of trade I got out of it.
Wow, that's amazing. For those that don't know, the Cat's Cradle is one of the premier, most iconic music venues in the nation. Wow. So, at this point, I know that you sold your first.
Sold my
comic.
first cartoon to the Durham Herald.
Okay.
I went in there. I was just knew nothing about the field. I think everybody who comes into political cartooning basically knows nothing about it until they actually get into it and start looking around.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, why would you?
Right.
And I figured, okay, I can put ink on paper. It makes sense to me. I will show this to newspapers around. And went over to the Durham Herald. This was all of 12 miles away.
And did they have an editorial cartoonist at the time?
They did not. They had an art department.
Okay.
And the art department did one cartoon a week for the Sunday paper. Okay. And that was its only editorial cartooning. But the art department also, because at the time there were two newspapers there, the morning paper and the evening paper. And the art department basically worked standard 9 to 5 hours, which is fine if you're on putting out the afternoon paper, because they're there when you're going to press.
Right.
But if you're the evening paper, if you're the morning paper and you go to press at midnight and the art department's not there and you need a map or a chart or something, you're stuck. And so they basically hired me to hang around just in case they need something.
Okay.
And but I could also draw cartoons in my free time, editorial cartoons, which I discovered was what I really wanted to do. And so I said, well, whatever else I did, I'm going to turn out a cartoon a day.
So were you on salary doing this?
It started out freelance. I started out freelancing cartoons for them one at a time for like $25 a piece. If I sold 3 a week, it was a good week. Right. So that was kind of the income stream from cartooning.
And tell me,
at that time.
At that time, I'm assuming that, that's not very much money. Even back then, you surely had to have another job that was waiting for you so that you could pay bills and stuff like that. Or what was it?
Well, at that time, you could rent a house in Carborough for $100 a month. So
a little bit different than
from today. Yeah, I had a little money coming in from some farmland that I owned down in South Carolina. My father died a long while back, and his share of the land was divided up among the 5 children, of whom I was the oldest. I was an only child for 3 years. It's great, but then the brothers and sisters came along, and everything went to hell. But and I went to my room and drew cartoons for the rest of my life.
Right.
But no, actually, I love the brothers and sisters. And but I had about just a couple of $1,000s coming in.
Yeah.
But back in the 1970s, a couple of $1,000s a year plus whatever spare change you could pick up would actually live you the postgraduate student life in Chapel Hill.
Yeah. And did you catch the bug of making this as a career for yourself at that time? Or?
I did catch the bug. There was a lot of it going around then. The 70s was a very fertile time for political cartooning because first of all, you had just in the news, you had the Vietnam War, you had Watergate in 73, 4, and you had the presidency of Lyndon Johnson followed by Richard Nixon. So that was like 1963, 1974 right there. And there was a whole early baby boom generation growing up who had early on discovered Mad Comics, Mad Magazine in the 50s.
Right.
We're reading that. In the 1960s, that whole generation might have gone into some other form of humor, or not even into some form of humor at all. But in 1964, an Australian named Pat Oliphant came to the United States from the Australian Advertiser. He'd been working over there for an obscure Australian publisher named Rupert Murdoch.
Oh, wow.
And he came to the Denver Post. He had toured the United States in the late 50s and said, I want to be a political cartoonist in America. That was what Oliphant said. And the newspaper had sent him around the world to do one of those tours that you do when you live in the back of beyond, and to see the world. But they made him sign a 5-year contract before he left, so he wouldn't find a better job while abroad and take it. 5 years to the day after he got back from his trip, he handed in his notice in Denver and handed in his notice in Australia and went to the Denver Post. I mean, it was a case of going from Friday to Monday.
Wow.
And basically redeveloped the American editorial cartoon.
Really?
He was the first, not the first, but one of the first cartoonists to really make the horizontal format work as opposed to the old-fashioned vertical format.
Sure.
The tall person standing there, the sort of Herblock vision of Mr. Baum threatening the world. And Mr. Baum is very tall and the world is very small, and you can put it in a magazine-size cover rectangle. Oliphant started doing cinematic stuff with large casts and spread out like a widescreen movie.
Okay.
He was influenced by various cartoonists and other humorists. I mean, the influences go back.
Right.
Everybody goes back to Nast and Gilray, basically, which is the 18th century and the 19th century for cartooning.
And they were all doing vertical format too, no? Or?
They were all doing horizontal. They were mostly horizontal formats. Okay. Cartoons tended to get sold as prints. In the early days, they were sold separately. You bought a cartoon by itself for a couple of pennies. And they were mostly wide instead of tall. But you'd switch. You could go both ways, but the standard format was wide simply because when you see a picture of a crowd of people, you think of it being a wide shot and not a tall shot.
Yeah.
And they were doing scenery. Scenery is horizontal.
Sure.
Caricature people are vertical.
Right.
And this was starting on the large crowds of people school of caricature instead of the large head saying something school of caricature.
Yeah, okay. So fast forwarding back to the 70s, though, you also had National Lampoons, which was certainly trying to, it was, I guess an era of the...
That was it. I was a charter subscriber to the National Lampoon.
Okay.
They'd had a card in their 1969 parody of Time magazine, which came out in the fall of 69.
Okay.
I'd actually been subscribing to the Harvard Lampoon. Not the National, but the Harvard Lampoon before the National came along, because in 1966, the Harvard Lampoon put out a famous parody of Playboy magazine. That was my senior year in high school. Perfect time to encounter a parody of Playboy. I mean, it was only a year or so earlier that I'd encountered the real Playboy.
Right.
And if you're off at a boarding school, Playboy is kind of like the secular Bible. Every room you go out, every month, the roommates decide who buys the copy you tear up and who buys the copy you actually read. But that encouraged me in the way of humor and the Lampoon type stuff.
Right.
And so I started subscribing to it and reading it. So when the National Lampoon came along 4 years later, I was hipped for that. And yeah, that was really one of the starts. That started at Harvard, but the whole Saturday Night Live school of humor, the whole airplane movie, spoof movie school of humor that's so modern today, a lot of that grew out of the old Harvard Lampoon, National Lampoon axis.
And what was the newspaper scene like back then? How did they take to somebody like you who's so different than everybody else on staff, essentially?
It's hard. I was lucky. I was very lucky at the Durham Herald because the editor at the time and just because of the situation there with when the art department went home and the fact that the editor liked me due to the fact that I was freelance, I was drawing cartoons and selling them one at a time.
Right.
And they after about a year and a half of that, they said, we'd like to give you a part-time job. So 20 hours a week for not much money, coming in half a day. I didn't even have a desk.
What kind of, like how often were you, what was your input like? Or your output?
I was coming in every afternoon, basically, and at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, they would have the editorial meeting for the day, which has nothing to do with the editorial page. It's the whole layout of the newspaper, where you decide what stories go on the front page and what's inside and what's on the local front.
And are you a part of those meetings?
I attended those every day, just simply because that's a great way to find out what the stories are that are going to be in the next morning's paper. Since even then, I worked 2 days ahead. So basically, I would find out about something. Say if it was a big story that day, it would be in the Tuesday paper, if it was a Monday that we were talking. And my cartoon about it would be in the Wednesday paper.
I see.
So at least people had a chance to digest it.
Yeah.
But it also helped because when I went that evening to draw the cartoons, I got in the habit of drawing the cartoons at night before I went home. Sometimes that meant I didn't get home till 2 in the morning.
Right.
But the cartoon got drawn.
Yeah.
But I would just do that. And again, after about 3 or 4 months of being there every day part-time through the meeting, they said, well, we can put you on the staff full-time, can't pay you much, but we'll give you your own desk, so you won't have to keep carrying this little drawing table around from desk to desk, depending on who isn't at work that day.
Yeah. And did you have any reactions that were coming from the public? Were people positive, negative to the stuff you were putting out?
I got very little reaction, which I think is very fortunate because a good cross-section of the public might have been like 97% wondering what it was doing there and 3% knowing me personally. Yeah. But I got better. Doug Marlette, who was the cartoonist for the Charlotte Observer for years, had a great line. He said, if you keep doing something, it's hard to get worse at it. And I kept doing that and didn't get worse at it for years and years. But I really don't think I actually started getting good at it until I had been doing it for about 8 or 9 years.
And were you doing, was your content local, national, global?
I started out doing entirely local because there was nobody else providing that. That's usually the way most political cartoonists have started, is by doing contributing a local cartoon every now and then and sort of talking their way into the building somehow.
Right.
Get a job doing anything. That's one person gave me the advice: if you want to be a cartoonist for a particular publication, get a job on that publication doing anything, and start shoving cartoons at them until they get sick of seeing them. They'll either fire you or start running your cartoons.
Right. What was the highlight? You were there for 20 years, right?
I was at the Independent for 20 years. 21 years. I was at the Herald for 9 years. And the highlight, what was the highlight? Getting better at it. I mean, every day was a struggle to draw another cartoon. I mean, the entire time I was there, I literally did not start a single day knowing I was going to draw a cartoon that day. I knew I was going to try, but whether or not I would come up with an idea, who knows? And it took years. It took me nearly a decade at the Independent before I fully got over the idea that, oh my God, yesterday might have been the last day there was anything in the well. And I discovered that yeah, they can be generated. They come along. Thinking about cartoons brings cartoons into existence.
It must have been different and maybe slightly relieving. I'm assuming that when you go to the Independent, obviously it's a weekly publication, whereas with the Durham Herald, you're working on a couple throughout the week, so you've got a lot more demand.
I did 5 a week for them back in the day. And for most of that time, it was 2 days ahead. Right. So I had that safety that if I somehow drew a complete blank one day, I could always make it up the next day and try to find a second idea. For some reason, every time I drew a complete blank for a day, I did come up with 2 ideas the next day. So I'm not sure. I couldn't trigger it unless it was absolute panic setting in to do that. Right. But that was back in the days when there were more newspapers around and cartoonists were a big thing. There was a craze in the late 70s, early 80s. There was kind of an editorial cartoonist boom going on then. Partly it was because of the people, this whole baby boom generation that had grown up with Mad and had seen Oliphant when it was in high school and started to get interested in cartooning, was now out of college and thinking of political cartooning as a career. And Dwayne Powell, who spent years at the News and Observer, is part of that age cohort. Mike Peters of the Dayton Daily News, Ben Sargent at the Austin American Statesman, Tony Auth in Philadelphia. There's this whole generation of cartoonists who are now retired or gone on to the great beyond.
Like Dwayne Powell.
Like Dwayne, yes, who came along in the late 60s, early 70s. Yeah. Under the influence of Oliphant and the other main influence, Jeff McNelly, who was a local boy here. He went to UNC Chapel Hill, was from up in New York, that area. Okay. But started contributing to the Chapel Hill newspaper, the Chapel Hill Weekly it then was, back in the 70s. And as soon as he spent after a few years there, never graduated from UNC, sort of dropped out after his junior year, but ended up being hired by the Richmond News Leader and something like age 23 won the Pulitzer Prize for Best Editorial Cartoonist of the Year, becoming the second youngest person ever to win that award after Bill Malden during World War II. Right. And McNelly was one of those geniuses that pops out every now and then, an amazing cartoonist, an amazing draftsman. And he was local. He came out of Chapel Hill. He was drawing for the Daily Tar Heel. Another cartoonist, John Branch, who was my age or a few years younger, was also at the UNC at that time, drawing for the Tar Heel. So there were people actually drawing political cartoons that I knew of from this area. It wasn't like a totally alien occupation. Yeah. So I did it. And I think a lot of people were just seeing, this is new, this is a different style of stuff, this is stuff I find funny. I'm a young man starting out, almost invariably men saying that starting out. Why don't I draw cartoons for a newspaper? I like this stuff. See what happens. And since there were still bunches of newspapers, I mean, back then there were at least 12 towns in North Carolina that had 2 daily newspapers, morning and afternoon. Now there are none.
That's actually a really good question, going back to a bunch of young dudes. What is it about editorial cartoonists that you don't necessarily see women in the field as much?
Well, that's changing. And there have always been women in the field. They've just been like either not hired by daily newspapers or working. A lot of the reasons for it is the women who go into cartooning tend to have something they want to say with it. The women's suffrage movement attracted many cartoonists. I mean, the abortion legalization movement attracted many women cartoonists. You can, if the subject is there, they'll get attracted. I think one of the main reasons is just a hiring thing. And most newspapers, even if they're trying for diversity, by diversity they mean they mean having men and women and black and white and whatnot on the staff or in the group or in the room. They don't mean we're going to give 100% of the jobs to blank, except what happens when you got one job? Okay, are we going to give 100% of the cartooning job, singular, to a woman? Right. That's when they start getting the willies about inclusiveness. Wait a minute, and or what? I mean, it's hard to say what that was. Yeah,
but you do see that changing now.
Yeah, it is changing. There are more women doing it. Ann Telnays at the Washington Post is doing animated cartoons online for the Post. Oh wow! She's not in the paper itself; she's in their online edition. So that's 2 signs of the future rolled into one. Yeah. And or the present, but the last winner of the Best Young Editorial Cartoonist Award that we gave was a woman.
Oh, wow.
So it's
But I do want to ask you about, obviously, the industry has changed so much since you started. What is it that when did you start to see that big change, and how do you think that affected your specific niche in the industry?
Well, the cartoonist, we have said for years that we were the canary in the coal mine. And it certainly turned through the big decline of the newspaper industry. When I started, as a matter of fact, for almost the entire time I was at the Durham Herald, there had been no technological changes in cartooning since the invention of photo engraving, and that was the 19th century.
Yeah.
I mean, if you drug Thomas Nast out of his grave and somehow revitalized him from the 1870s, you could
get up.
You could set him down in a 1980s newsroom and say, "Here's a pen, here's paper, here's ink."
I saw a clip on YouTube from a previous documentary. I think it was on the closing of the print, the traditional printing of at the New York Times.
Oh yeah,
and I think it happened early '80s, mid '80s,
early '80s, late '70s. When I first came to the Durham Herald in '79, when I joined the staff there, one of the first things they did was sit me down and some newly hired reporters and teach us how to use the computer system. It was a brand new computer system, the first they'd ever had in the newsroom. So everyone, the old grizzled veterans with the cigar smoke running down their chest, grumbling into the keyboard about these damn computer systems. Green letters on black background. If you did, you could type in stuff as it would appear on the page if you knew the codes. I mean, for instance, caret CC 1, 15, 10, 11.5 was a column of newsprint, close caret, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then the second system they got in, you could actually see it on the screen. You could you could look at what you got.
Okay.
But that whole thing coming in was a huge change.
Right.
We didn't see how it would affect the receiving end of it, because this was a business equipment. This wasn't stuff coming into people's homes. This was coming into the office. And but it wasn't until
you didn't see it affecting content.
It didn't affect the content. It didn't affect the circulation. Circulation took a dip in the early '90s, but that was part recession, part Gulf War recession, and part rising newsprint prices. Somehow the price of newsprint is like coffee in Brazil. It always goes up, but it never goes down. They never have weather that increases the coffee crop. They never seem to have weather that brings down the newsprint prices. But I think they're coming down now because so many fewer people are buying them. But it's the circulation took a hit then. It took a hit in the recession that followed 9/11.
Right.
And
the first Gulf War, I'm assuming you guys just saw it as like a natural ebb and flow.
It's a natural ebb and flow.
Yeah.
It'll come back, and it did,
Sure.
sort of come back over the '90s. It never got to quite as big as it was, but the '80s was when all the afternoon newspapers closed out, and all the towns became one-paper towns.
Yeah.
But it really began. I really began to see it affecting newspapers more in the 2000s. I mean, newspapers are always something that people pick up once they start caring about what the school board does, and once they have kids, and once they have the station wagon.
Yeah.
It isn't something you read. You pick up the alternative weekly. In the old days, you picked up the alternative weekly to see what times the movies and the club shows started.
Right.
And that was the reading.
Right. Yeah.
But these days, now that everything's online, we're looking for a new mechanism, and they haven't found it yet. I mean, the stuff that journalists do is going to be in demand. It is in demand. People are reading it all the time.
Yeah.
We just haven't figured out a way to get it from the old delivery mechanism from a wad of paper thrown into your yard to the new delivery mechanism, which is a screen that you can type on and read stuff you don't have to pay for.
How does a place like the Independent Weekly, how did they survive? I'm always curious about this. You got the Independent Weekly, who has a publication that you can pick up and read at a coffee shop.
Yeah.
But you can also read the exact same content online.
Right.
So how is it that they're actually... I mean, are they thriving in that kind of environment?
They're not thriving in that. Nobody's thriving in the current. Nobody who puts words on pieces of paper is thriving in the current environment, except maybe the people who print ramen labels. As somebody, I remember a discussion I once went to talking about the future of print, and somebody said, look, print's going to be around until you can print labels on the cans. And so there will always be publishing, whether it'll be, and there'll always be reading.
Yeah.
But magazines just might, it happened with theater. It used to be this great popular entertainment. Now it's kind of a niche for a certain class of people who like live theater. Radio used to be the medium of popular entertainment. Television has given way to the internet. Everything gives way to something else, but the kind of content it offers, people are still always going to want.
Yeah.
And what we haven't figured out is just how to put the meter up. If somebody invents an app that charges people 1/100th of a penny every time they look at a cartoon, so you can look at 1,000 cartoons for $1,
right,
or something like that.
Yeah.
Cartoonists just might get rich because there are a lot of people who are willing to spend that little bit of money to look at something, but they just haven't come up with the collection mechanism yet.
Yeah, it seems like it's a little bit complicated, similar to the music industry, too.
Yeah, the music industry just did it by, the people who put the stuff out pay the royalties. You radio station, people are listening to you because you're playing music. Pay us money. Somehow saying to Facebook, okay, Facebook, you're making money because people are looking at this content online.
Yeah.
Pay us for the privilege of doing it. That didn't work because it's the individuals posting it and not the basic organization itself posting it.
Yeah.
And how you stop people from taking stuff and scanning it. It may just go back to the scanner.
Right.
Once you can make a copy of something and put it where anybody who sees it can make a copy of it, selling copies of stuff is going to get difficult.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your the political situation right now is obviously very volatile, but comics find this as it's Shangri-La in some ways because there's so much content to talk about. There's so much fodder.
Yes.
Obviously that's going to be the same case for political cartoonists, editorial cartoonists. There's just so much to talk about. What do you think about the current political landscape, and how did that affect how you created your work?
Well, somehow if you think of the current political landscape as Trump and after, which seems to be where current is these days, I stopped drawing cartoons for the Indie at the beginning of 2018. So I really only had a couple of years of Trump as phenomenon and president to work with. And what I've noticed is that history seems to have dropped completely. The past. We are living in an odd period when past, not just distant past, but even yesterday past, doesn't matter to anybody. You can say something one day and say the opposite of that the next day.
Right. And
the people who have made you their hero are going to believe it just as much the one day as the other.
Yeah.
In a way,
why do you think that is?
I think it's because, I put it down in part to the whole anonymizing of the internet. Basically, what we discovered once anybody could say what they wanted to say on the internet was that huge numbers of people want to say stuff that will change other people's minds or get a rise out of them or stir an emotional reaction. And they don't particularly care whether it's true or not, which kind of was always the break on that. There was always some level of commentary where if it goes out and it has your name on it, you care whether it makes sense. You care whether it matters. You cared whether it was consistent with what you were saying yesterday. Right. That was true whether you were a senator or a cartoonist or a guy who writes opinions for the newspaper or even just somebody talking to your neighbors.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's still true with regard to the neighbors. I suspect it is because you don't want them calling the police on you. But as far as everything else, it's like public life is a front. If you appear in public, you do it in a mask, and you no more expect the person behind that mask to be telling you the truth than you expect the guy playing King Lear to be disinheriting his daughters in real life. It just doesn't happen that way. And another part of it I put just back to television. This is I realize I'm 70 years old right now, and I think my generation, people around my age, may be the last people to really remember before television. When houses didn't have television sets in them. Yeah. When the evening came and it got dark and your parents sat by and read, or they may have listened to they did things. They went out and played bridge or things. And I still think of television as that thing in the corner of the room that is a picture.
Yeah.
It's not the world, but a lot of people seem to think that's the world. That, if I see my view of what the world is like, whether it's Bangladesh or the streets of the ghetto or downtown New York City, is based on what I see on television.
Right.
And if what I see on television is about a quarter of an inch deep, then the way my brain works is going to be a quarter of an inch deep, just because that's the pond you're swimming in.
Yeah. I think also in some ways, and let me know if you agree or disagree, I think the advent of the internet, the advent of even cable TV, creates a lot more space for people to talk, to add content, to put things out there, whether it's opinion or what,
right?
And so the fact that there's just so much stuff out there, I think people. You have a lot more blips of information where people can capture something for a moment, but then there's 5,000 other things that are happening directly after that, 5 minutes later, right?
That is true. That is true.
So, in some ways, I kind of feel like political cartoonists and editorial cartoonists have something that is incredibly vital, because what they're doing is they're speaking truth to power, but they're doing it with a comic sensibility, right?
A comic sensibility, and very briefly.
Right.
Brevity is the soul of wit, but it's also, I think it's been speculated that the average person who looks at a political cartoon looks at it for 7 seconds.
Right. Yeah.
Which is probably about as long as, not as long as it takes you to read a postcard.
Sure.
But if you hit people with a different postcard, a different cartoon, say 250 days a year, 5 days a week for 50 weeks, eventually it's like writing a postcard every week. You're going to be able to make an impression on them. And they get to hear your voice.
Right.
As with reading poetry, you really have to know the voice of when this person draws that. Oh, that's a bad sign. What does that mean when that is there?
Yeah.
The symbolism, the world you create. Like comic strip artists, cartoonists create these little worlds.
You do.
And we put things in them.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the great, again, just to push on this a little bit more, because I think what you and others that are within the industry are doing that is so vitally important. And I think in some ways it's actually more important than what a lot of a lot of the writing that's done. You are kind of crystallizing for a moment. I think people actually capture ideas better when they see it in visual format rather than written by the written word, right?
I think so. It's certainly more, it's more memorable. I mean, pictures before words, as always, just for sticking in your mind.
Yeah.
And it's and the brevity of it's a condensation of ideally a cartoon should be a condensation of a fairly subtle argument, but it can't be a subtle thing itself. It has to be.
Even as you were saying before, when you're looking at a political cartoon, you may only get an impression for 6 seconds. They look at it for 6 seconds, but you can very much say that to a great joke in a stand-up routine, right?
Right. Yes.
You only hear it for 15 seconds or so, but that 15 seconds may actually stick in their mind 2 hours later when they're talking about it over a drink, right?
Exactly. And one of the things I tried to do with my cartoons was to sort of knock people out of preconceptions.
Yeah.
It's a way of saying one thing you can do with it is just, I didn't look at it that way, is I think a very good reaction, a perfectly legitimate reaction to get from a political cartoon.
Yeah. On that note, how do you come to that? How do you figure out what that needs to be?
Well, when I was doing it regularly, you have to start with a subject. What to draw the cartoon? Just basically, what do I want to draw a cartoon about today? Yeah. Now, what's the thing? If you're following after what I was doing, I don't recommend this to anybody unless they're being paid to do it. But I used to read lots of newspapers and watch lots of television news, and this was even before it was the 24-hour day stuff. But the noon news, the 6 o'clock news, the 11 o'clock news, all that stuff. And if you get through, you notice it forms patterns. It's like watching the ocean for a long enough time. You see certain currents and certain types of waves going through, and you kind of develop this is going to be a big story later this week, is the ideal state to get in, because you're kind of having to shoot at a target that hasn't really arrived yet. If you're working 1 or 2 days or a half a week ahead,
sure.
It has to be something that will still be in people's minds or suddenly be coming into people's minds while you're commenting on it.
Yep.
And if you can get that down, if you can do that's a help. But I will come up with what I think is the good subject, the subject that will be in that day's paper. If I'm at a loss, when I was working with the Independent, frequently I'd just say, what's in the magazine this week?
Yeah.
I would go in once a week at the Indy and talk to the editor about what was in the magazine, what had been in recently, what was the news, what would they want a cartoon on. Sometimes they might want a cartoon on something because it was a big story.
Yeah.
Can
you give an example just to give context a little bit?
Give an example. Well, let's see. Well, one day I came in. This was during the 2016 presidential race. And I just said, well, everything was Trump. Naturally, this was during the primaries. Everything was Trump. So I said, well, there hadn't been much about the statewide elections lately, So my editor said, yeah, do something about state. Yeah, good. We're having some statewide election. We're electing a governor. Look into that. Do something. You got an idea? No, I don't know. Okay, so I went home and stared at the wall. Cartoon ideas live in the wall. And so Jim Borgman, that's a joke by another cartoonist. But the cartoon ideas live in the wall, and if you stare at the wall long enough, they will come out. And I began to realize that I was not caring much about the governor's races. I mean, I just didn't see myself drawing a Pat McCrory cartoon that day. I'd been bashing him for months as our governor. He was running for re-election.
Sure.
And so I finally said, well, Trump is that will be the subject of my cartoon. Ended up being how Donald Trump was driving everything else out of off the front pages, out of people's consciousness. Nobody was paying attention to the statewide local races because this guy. So I said, well, okay, what's a visual? I just need to get an amusing visual metaphor for that situation,
right.
And that will be the cartoon. Well, the first thing this was the oldest thing. I'm almost ashamed to talk about myself in this way, but the most obvious symbol for a race is a race. People running. Somebody's trying to get to the finish line before somebody else. That's why we keep falling back on that. Oh, race, politics. What can I do? And so I drew this. I said, oh, this is going to be complicated. So I had to start playing with angles and things. And where do I want to be standing when I'm looking at this? And sometimes you can come up with an idea, but you don't really have a picture in your head of what it's going to look like. So
that's the fun part.
That's the fun part. That is the thinking with a pencil part, where you put, and it's not really a word thing, which is why I'm stumbling here. It's just a putting the pencil down on the paper and making marks and seeing if you can get well, finally I said, okay, put a racetrack in the foreground and put the grandstand behind it, because this whole part the people aren't looking at the race. Empty grandstand, boring. It's try to avoid cartoons that depend on something being empty to make your point. I mean, you can do it, but you're asking the reader to do all the work. And so I came up with, okay, the grandstands, and I have all these people in the grandstands, but they're standing at the back of them, not at the front, and they're looking over the back into the distance. This racetrack is kind of in a park, if you can picture that. You can only see the front part. But it's in a park with the grandstand, and over across the far side of the park, where you see the line of trees and the buildings beyond it, there is a huge Empire State Building, and there's this giant orange gorilla climbing the Empire State Building, swatting away at the biplanes, and he looks sort of like Donald Trump, and and everybody's looking at him, and nobody is looking at the people crossing the finish line down front that says state and local races.
Brilliant.
So I drew that up, and then it took me maybe 2 hours of playing around with things on pieces of paper just to get stuff where I wanted it.
Yeah.
And once I did that, I had this rough draft, a piece of paper that looked like it had been gone over by a herd of beasts. And I put it on a light box, put a clean sheet of paper on top of it, and basically drew on top. I didn't trace it exactly, but I knew where the things were in the picture because I'd been moving them around and putting them places and getting them where they belonged. And that took maybe 45 minutes, an hour to do. So from a blank sheet of paper to the finished cartoon was an hour, but getting to the point where I had the thing to make the finished cartoon from was the work. And that's the way most of them work. My cartoons look deceptively tossed off. I do a lot of work in pencil because pencil just looks more informal than ink.
Yeah.
It looks like something you might erase if you don't like it, and sometimes I do erase it when I don't like it. But if you put that down, and it's quick. So if, the table, the legs on your table might wobble if you built that in real life. Yeah, but this guy's eyeball is half as big as his other eyeball. So,
well, the beauty of your work, though, is the fact that it does almost look like a concept sketch. Like it's the one that happens just before
the finish,
ink, right? But the beauty of it is that it's got so much character. I can feel you actually working through the idea, and that's why it's so. There's so much life in a lot of the drawings that I've seen of yours. It's
lots of cartoonists. I mean, a standard cartoonist complaint is that, there's something missing in the final drawing that was there in the rough sketch.
Yeah.
And
100%.
And the only way I've found to get around that is to just
keep it.
Keep the sort of start at what would be the next to last draft.
Yeah. When was that a conscious decision for you?
It was. I made a conscious decision about 15, 16 years ago to start doing more work in pencil.
Interesting.
Everybody starts out drawing in pencil.
Sure.
I mean, nobody gives little kids pens. They give them pencils. Nobody gives kids permanent ink.
Yeah.
So pencil on notebook paper was where I started out, and I'm now working in pencil on typing paper.
Interesting.
I mean, I go down to the Office Depot and buy reams of copy machine paper.
Yeah,
not totally high quality.
But before then, you were doing it more like traditionally.
I was doing it more traditionally. I mean, I started out doing rough sketches on paper, and then inking over that and erasing the pencil lines and doing thick lines. I experimented with all sorts of styles.
Right.
The advantage of not having art training is that you're ignorant enough to go everywhere.
Yeah.
And I mean, one cartoon I would do would look like a David Levine cartoon, and the next one would look like a Hugh Haney cartoon, which is another way of saying one would be all crosshatchy and scrawly and scratchy and done with a very thin pen line, and the other would look like it was drawn with a paintbrush on the side of a barn, with great big lines and smooth curves and total precision. And I just discovered that you draw what you... Jeff McNally gave a great piece of advice once. He said, draw what you want to draw. I mean, if you don't like drawing the tail fins on Cadillacs, don't develop a style where you have to draw the tail fins on Cadillacs all the time.
Did you get any kickback from the newspapers that were saying, why is it
in pencil and not ink?
Yeah.
No, because another thing that had happened by this time that couldn't have happened back in the 80s was that the engraving department had gone away. The idea of handing your original art to someone who turned it into the thing that would be put on the press to be seen in the paper went away with the computers. It's now a matter of I draw the picture, I sit at my computer, scan it in, touch it up. If the colors are too garish or too light, I can retone it in the computer. I can erase eraser marks or pencil marks that I see. If I've misspelled a word, I can change it. Again, in the computer, send that to the paper to be published.
Yeah.
And they can then just place that down on the page. And I will know what it looks like. In the bad old days, when you sent it to engraving, you couldn't use gray tones. All cartoons had to be solid black and white.
Right.
Just like the text had to be solid black and white. That was all they printed. If you wanted gray, you could put down a sheet of little dots and rub them, and the dots came off. Some of them came off where you wanted them on the cartoon, and some of them came off on your hand, and some came off on your clothes, and some came off on the parts of the cartoon you didn't want it on. And that was how you got gray.
When did that actually stop, though? Because I definitely remember I've seen lots of editorial cartoons where you start to see the shading happening in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
So was that, I guess, before then?
It was before and after. There have basically been two big styles of editorial cartooning in history. There is simplicity and there is ornateness. I mean, this is probably true of all art. You get the Rococo end and you get the classical end,
Sure.
And the beginning of cartooning was very ornate because it was engraving. It was either wood engraving or pen engraving. It was all scratching tiny, narrow lines. That's why when you look at 19th century cartoons, like things of Boss Tweed and those things from old Punch magazines, you see all this cross-hatching because that's how they got the shading in. Eventually, people invented ways to fake the shading. The same way the Lettertone company, the same people who made those transfer dot patterns that you can put down and made the transfer letters. You could put transfer dot patterns. There was also a company that made something called called duo-shade paper, which was a special kind of cartoon drawing paper, almost entirely used by editorial cartoonists and fashion illustrators. For some reason, they specialized in it, that had an invisible, very light blue lines running across it. And if you went over it with a brush and dipped your brush in this magic liquid and did over the paper, the lines appeared. There were two liquids, and one brought out a set of parallel lines running diagonally across the paper, and the other brought out two sets of diagonal lines running across from each other to make a darker shade, and that was your two shades of gray. And those were the two shades of gray you had in cartooning, because you could hand it to somebody, and even anybody could take it to the production department and shoot it and get a black and white picture that was what you wanted to see. Any other way of making gray could drop out. I've had gray drop out entirely. I've had gray turn solid black. You just never could know. But now we have scanners that can pick up gray tones. The artist can get what the artist wants and send it on to production. Several times I've drawn cartoons that were in color. I decided, this doesn't need to be a full color cartoon. Yeah. I changed it to black and white, put the black and white copy on top of the color copy, and cut out part of the black and white copy, so there were spots of color around the cartoon. Mainly just say the main character was in color and the rest of the cartoon was in black and white. Yeah. And it worked better because it focused you. I mean, color can be your enemy in cartooning because you want to know where the reader looks, and the color has to work toward pointing that. And I came to color late when it came to cartooning. I was a black and white man for decades.
It must have been terrifying.
Well, it's... you do it slowly, you try it once and you mess it up and you say, gee, this would have been better. But sometimes the urge keeps coming back. It was, I practiced on magazine covers, things like that. I practiced copying.
So it's super obvious that you are incredibly passionate about the history of editorial cartooning. How did that kind of come into play? Because I know that you were the secretary treasurer of the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists of the United States of America
and Canada, and yes, and I was.
So you were doing that for 12 years. Did that fuel your passion for learning so much about the history? And
it was as much the result of it. I would say it didn't so much anything I've ever been interested in. My first instinct is to get books on, collect about, read up on. Yeah. I just like knowing the past of things. Yeah. I think it might come from growing up in an old farmhouse. I mean, it's interesting to be able to go down into your own basement and find magazines and newspapers that were put there 60 years ago. Just hadn't been disturbed since.
Yep. I'm the same way.
Yep. Well, going down to the basement, I found a paper that had Theodore Roosevelt's death announced in it, front page of the New York Times from 1919. Wow. That kind of thing is just interesting. But and I'm interested in old paper, old magazines, old newspapers. The past just has always had a pull on me that way. And I think if you're going to do something, if you're going to draw political cartoons, you learn about it. You learn the history. Yep. It turned out to be a fascinating history. And I also learned that a lot of people who do it don't care about the history of it. They're interested in politics. Basically, political cartoonists, if they weren't political cartoonists, there were about half of them would become editorial writers and the other half of them would become caricaturists. It just depends on what mainly drew you in. And it's interesting to see people who are mainly drawn in by politics interacting with people who are mainly drawn in because, this is a way to draw pictures. I like doing this. But, of course, everybody's a mixture of the two.
Yeah. So you were there for 12 years, and that actually gave you your first chance to. You wrote a book. It was on the history of the AAEC.
It was. It was on
the 50th anniversary.
Our 50th anniversary. The AAEC, the Association of American Editorial Cartoonists, it's called. One of our early letters called it the American Association of Editorial Cartoonists, and people have been getting that wrong ever since, including us. On banners even. But the AAEC was founded in 1957 by a bunch of cartoonists, basically by one man named John Stampone, who was the cartoonist for the Army Times outside Washington, D.C., and was worried that the profession was dying out. At that time, there were only about 100 political cartoonists in the United States, which was down from many hundreds of them around the turn of the century, the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. But the jobs were disappearing primarily because syndication was coming along. And when you can buy a cartoonist, you can buy the best cartoonist in the country for $10 a week, and he doesn't care if you don't print his cartoons. versus having somebody in the office you have to pay a full salary to who will piss and moan to you if you don't run his work.
Right.
And you have to argue with about whether you can insult the owner of the newspaper, things like that. It's just easier to buy stuff you can syndicate and run or not run as you feel like it. But the numbers were shrinking, and so they started an organization to promote political cartooning. It was also a chance to get together once a year. This was back in the day before the internet, before the cell phone, when you might be the one of 2 or 3 cartoonists in your state, or the only one in 3 states.
It's a very lonely job.
It's a one person. It's usually a one person per newspaper job, and these days, of course, even then, it was becoming a one newspaper per town job. And it was a big newspaper at that. A newspaper, generally speaking, had to have about a circulation of, by my research, was once you get around 80,000 is about when a newspaper has a cartoonist.
Okay.
And to give you an idea, the News and Observer at its height was 150-something thousand, I think. And it had a cartoonist. The Durham Herald was around 50,000 and didn't, until I kind of talked my way onto the staff just by hounding them to death.
Yeah.
And but after that, larger than that, if you were larger than around 100,000, you had a political cartoonist. If you were the cartoonist in the state capital if you were a newspaper in the state capital, you had a cartoonist to report on because you were the legislative newspaper. And so that was kind of the number. It increased to around 200 maybe in the early 80s, maybe 150 to 200, and then really started shrinking when newspapers started cutting back, offering the buyouts and laying people off in the modern age.
So this is in the, late 50s or so?
This was in the first crisis in cartooning. We go from crisis to crisis. It's kind of like Preston Sturges, the movie director. His autobiography was called Between Flops. And cartooning has been between flops basically all our career. But the first flop was the rise of the syndicate, 1916 or thereabouts. William Randolph Hearst invents the King Syndicate to market comic strips and syndicated columns and political cartoons.
Wow.
Before that, if you wanted even if you had a circulation of 50, if you wanted a cartoon in your paper, you had to get somebody to draw it.
Yeah.
And if you couldn't draw, you had to pay somebody to draw it.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is the perfect situation to have. But you couldn't buy something and reuse it. There were no used cartoons, essentially, for sale.
So was the AAEC, was that brought together to... was
brought together primarily to bring the cartoonists together, just so they could meet each other and talk, to have a party once a year.
Unionize in some way, or
that was what editors and publishers were worried about. Right. But it was not that. It was never a guild in that sense. We didn't fight for better working conditions. The organization existed for people who had already made it. Essentially, it was like a lot of professional organizations. First you become a doctor and then you join the AMA, that kind of thing. First you become a cartoonist with a job on a newspaper.
Sure.
And then, as a matter of fact, that was really basically one of the requirements for membership, was that you had to be a cartoonist who was employed by a newspaper drawing political cartoons. Sure. And there were, at the time, maybe 80 people in the country who qualified for it, and most of them joined. Wow. Nowadays, there might be 40 people in the country who qualify, of whom maybe half are active members of this association, and there's some passive members, but it's not, and we have a lot of members these days who are interested professionally in cartooning, or interested as scholars, or are not full-time political cartoonists, but do it once or twice, a month for some publication, or just want to keep a hand in, or like me, are retired.
Right.
As a political cartoonist.
Yeah, and I guess in some ways you could see. I mean, there's plenty more to talk to you about, but one of the things that I see in the fact that you basically you left the Independent Weekly, you were almost forced into retirement. Is that right?
They quit paying me,
yeah.
And I think that's a very, very good hint that they're not going to run your cartoon. They don't particularly care whether they get any more of your cartoons.
Yeah.
But it came from on high. The decision was made by the owners out in Portland.
Yeah.
The Indy is owned by a very small chain of like 3 alternative weeklies.
Gotcha.
And they have been in had a circulation problem for at least a decade or so.
Yeah.
And the numbers aren't going up. I mean,
yep.
People don't pick if people use their phone to find out what time the movie starts, they're going to use their phone, and they will not pick up the Indy to do that.
So you were the canary in the coal mine there in that situation.
They had various. I was actually lasted longer than a lot of people. I was there for 20 years. I have no complaints about the Eddie. 21 years. Besides, I was also about 68 years old at the time, and I don't think alternative people can be 68 years old in the Alternative Weekly. I was becoming crotchety and set in my ways.
Well, the beauty of it is that you've got this full culmination, this very, very illustrative career. You've done so much, and now you've gotten to this point where you've done so much research, working with the AAC. And now you're producing your own book now, which is it complete now?
It is not complete,
and it's called the Parody Issue.
The Parody Issue is what I'm working on right now. It's not a book of cartoons. It's not a book of my cartoons. It won't have any pictures by me in it, but it's a history of newspaper and magazine parodies, because nobody has written that. People say, "You mean like The Onion?" And I say, well, no, not quite like The Onion. The Onion's a humor magazine. Mad is a humor magazine. National Lampoon was a humor magazine. But they all ran parodies in them. This is fake issues of real publications. One of the classic examples is Not the New York Times, which came out about 30 years ago during the newspaper strike. A bunch of people got together and decided to put out a fake issue of the New York Times during the New York newspaper strike, and issued a 24-page New York Times in October of 1978. Completely fake.
Wow.
Cover to cover. Sports section, style section, editorials, everything. And sold for a buck a copy and became a hit. Over 50 years ago, the Harvard Lampoon put out a parody of Playboy, which it was just spelled with asterisk, PL asterisk YB asterisk Y, and it was so successful they decided a few years later. They had put out national magazine parodies before, but they hadn't gone national with it. It had been like local issues of the magazine. Yeah. But with Playboy, it went national. It was such a success. 2 years later, they did a parody of Life that was much more expensive to produce. It was, full large-size magazine, glossy paper, full color everywhere, stiffed on the newsstand. Nobody was buying Life magazine anymore by 1968. So they had to put out a parody of Time the next year to make money of it. The cover of Time had a naked woman wearing a Newsweek apron to cover her modestly, holding up a copy of the same issue of Time. It was one of those infinity covers. And the cover line says, "Does sex sell magazines?" Sex sold that magazine. And so they made back the money they lost on Life.
Wow.
Henry
the
Beard.
answer was yes.
Yes, the answer was yes. Sex sells magazines. Henry Beard said to Doug Kinney and Henry Beard were talking, and one of them said, we could do this every week. And every month, rather. Yeah. And that's how the National Lampoon came about, was from the Harvard Lampoon parody issues.
Amazing.
And I was buying them. I was a senior in high school when the Harvard Lampoon parody of Time came out. I was an aspiring cartoonist when the New York Times was published. And not the New York Times was published. And I became interested in them. I've been collecting parody issues for some 50 years, and now have around 1,000 of them sitting around my house.
Okay, see, that's remarkable. Yeah. So you sent me a PDF that had 2 chapters. I thought it was actually the full book.
No, it's 66 pages.
I had no idea that there were that many parody magazines and publications out there.
There's a huge number of them, and they've never been written about. There are lots of books on the subject of parody, but they tend to be academic studies of literature. Yeah. Parody as literature is frequently anthologized. Parodies of writers come along all the time, but parodies of newspapers and magazines have never been studied. Yeah. Even they haven't. There aren't even any long magazine articles on the subject. I basically had to go straight for the research, thumbing through college humor magazines online.
Yeah. So as I was alluding to earlier, the good news is that now that you're in retirement, you're actually moving into this next phase, which is you get to do all this amazing research and writing here. So you're really pulling from a lot of the history of your own life, really, and your career to really. I'm assuming you're enjoying the entire process.
I'm enjoying the whole process. It's great. I would definitely say if you're going to retire at any point in your life, be sure you have something to do once you do it, because the daytime television gets old fast.
Yeah, and so you've got some potential activity with people who are interested.
I've spoken to some friends of mine. I have some contacts in actual real-life New York-style publishing, who are passing it around, and we'll see what happens. But if the book does come out, it will be over a year from now, because this sampler you're talking about is 2 chapters and an introduction of a book that my outline has 20 chapters long. So it's time to get back to the typewriter or the keyboard. I told somebody, I used that phrase the other day, and somebody looked at me like I'd referred to the horseless carriage.
Well, I am incredibly excited. I've only seen, I guess it was about 66 pages. Is
66
that right?
pages. I'll put in a plug for myself here, since it getting toward the end.
Please do.
I'm blogging about the subject of my book at www.magazineparody.com.
That's PARODY.
And if you can't spell magazine, you might not be interested in the subject matter. But it's all one word, magazineparody.com. I just posted just earlier this month, I posted a long thing on parodies done by the Wisconsin Octopus magazine, the humor magazine at the University of Wisconsin, that was killed in 1959 because its parody of Playboy offended the administration.
Wow, yeah.
That's the kind of thing you find out doing this stuff.
In that blog, you're not actually showing exact content from the book. It's just referencing certain elements from it.
I'm showing pieces of it. If I find a piece that I want to do blog content, it turns out blogging and writing a book are not exactly synchronous as far as one really serving the other. Yep. But I can carve pieces out of one to put in the other.
Perfect.
And so I'm trying to. There are about 48 different posts there, and many of them are substantial essays.
Yeah, I've gotten a chance to take a look at a few of them, and it's an amazing blog. So I definitely highly recommend that. You also have your own website, right?
My own website, which I have not updated lately. It's vcrogers.com, which is my name. V is for Virginius. C is for Cullum.
Wow.
That is why I go by VC Rogers online. But
and not on Instagram or any other social media, right?
I'm not on Instagram. I'm not on Twitter, and I will accept all your thanks for that. I don't read yours either, so you needn't read mine. But I'm on Facebook, and if you ever want to find me there, I occasionally announce that I posted a new blog post. But head to www.magazineparody.com. That'll be the place.
Fantastic. Cullum, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for stopping by tonight, and hopefully we'll talk soon.
Well, thank you much.
All right.
It's a pleasure being here.
All right, you take care.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Pencil Pushers Podcast. Follow us on Instagram at the Pencil Pushers Podcast for visual representation of our guest artwork, topics discussed, and anything else that contributes to the show. So be sure to subscribe. Tell a friend. Tell lots and lots of friends. Become a leadhead. And we're out.